This video is going to go over Chapter 6.5, starting on page 316, 19 through 43 odd, and then 51, 53, and 61. The first section asks us to express each percent as a fraction or mixed number in simplest form and as a decimal. So what it's asking us to do is take this percent, we need to convert it to a fraction or a mixed number. We have to make sure that that is in simplest form, and then we also have to convert the percent to a decimal. So we need a fraction in simplest form and we need a decimal. Well, the first thing to do is take that 88% and convert it to a fraction over 100. But that's not in simplest form. We can definitely divide the top and the bottom by 2 and get 44 over 50. We can divide it by 2 again and get 22 over 25. We can't divide those by 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. Those are the simplest form. So how do we convert 88% to a decimal? Well, we just divide 88 by 100, and that gives us 0.88. Another way to think about it is to take 88.0% and just move that dot over 2 steps. And you'll get 0.88. Question 21 asks us to do the same for 87.5%. So this time we convert 87.5 over 100. We can't have this little decimal point in a fraction, so the way to get rid of it is to multiply the top and the bottom by 10. That'll move that decimal point over by 1. So we'll end up with 875 over 1,000. These two things are equal. We just multiplied it by 10 to get rid of the little decimal point. But now I got a lot of dividing to do because these are not in simplest forms. First thing I'll do is divide the top and the bottom by 5. I end up with 175 over 200. Well, looks like I can divide by 5 again. And if I do that, I get 35 over 40. Wait, it looks like I can divide by 5 again. And if I do that, I end up with 7/8. And that I cannot divide anymore. So if you follow these steps, you'll figure out that 87.5 over 100 can actually be written as 7 over 8. What about that second part of our problem where we have to write it as a decimal? Well, we just do it the same way we did before. We divide 87.5 by 100 and we get 0.875. Or another way of thinking about it is we take our decimal point and just move it over 2. And again, we get 0.875. Don't get freaked out when we get a percent that is over 100. For 23, we can just write it as 350 over 100. The nice thing about fractions is when we get zeros at the ends, we can just cross them out. And we're left with 35 over 10. To simplify that, I just divide by 5. And I get 7 over 2. If I want to write it as a mixed fraction, it's the same thing as 3.5. In order to get the decimal, I just take 350 and divide it by 100, and that equals 3.5. Question 25 asks us to convert 61%. So we write it as 61 over 100. Well, I can't divide 61 by anything that I can divide 100 by. That is the simplest form. And if I divide 61 by 100, I get 0.61, and that is the decimal form. With question 27, again, there's not much I can do with this. 223 divided by 100 is the simplest form. If I want to write it as a mixed number, that's the same thing as 2 and 23 over 100. 23 is a prime number. There's nothing I can do with that. If I want to get the decimal version, I can do it the same way. I divide 223 by 100, or I can think about it as moving the decimal point over 2 spots. And I'll just end up with 2.23. That is the decimal version. This one's just a little bit tricky because we're going to have to move that decimal point over quite a bit. 0.53 over 100. If we multiply it by 10 on the top and bottom, that decimal point will only move over 1 spot. So we've got to multiply it by 100 on the top and bottom to get it over 2 spots to get rid of it entirely. So what we'll end up with is 53 over 100 times 100 is 10,000. And believe it or not, that is the simplest form of that fraction. Moving the decimal point over 2 when we divide by 100 to get the decimal version, I have to move it 2 spots that way. And I'm going to end up with 0.0053 as my decimal version. So 0.53% is the same thing as 53 ten-thousandths and 0.0053. The next section asks us to express each fraction or decimal as a percent, rounding to the nearest tenth. I find the easiest way to do these is just to plug my fraction into a calculator, and I get 0.225. Well, when I went from a percent to a fraction or decimal, I divided by 100. So to go back, I need to multiply times 100%. And what do I end up with? 22.5%. If I plug 14 divided by 8 into my calculator, I get 1.75. To convert that to a percent, I just multiply it by 100%, and I get 175%. Now let's stop for a second and think, does that make sense that I have more than 100%? Well, it does, because the top of my fraction is bigger than the bottom. 14 over 8, if I put that over 100, I've got to have something bigger than 100 up here. So it must be 175%. 35 asks for 20 over 1,200. If I plug that into my calculator, I end up with 0.017. If I multiply that times 100%, I get 1.7%. To convert 0.09 into percent, I just multiply it by 100%, and I get 9%. I just moved that decimal over 2 spots. (39) asks us to convert 2.7 to a percent. So I multiply it by 100%, and I get 270%. Anytime I'm going from a decimal to a percent, I just have to multiply it by 100 and add the percent sign. The last one like this is 0.0006. If I multiply by 100%, I'm just going to move the decimal point over 2 spots. So this equals 0.06%. Question 43 says, 46% of the world's water is in the Pacific Ocean. What fraction is this? Well, let's write it as 46%. That is not the simplest form, so if we divide by 2 on the top and the bottom, we'll end up with 23 over 50. That is simplest form for the fraction of the world's water. 51 asks us to choose the greatest number out of this set. Well, the easiest way to do this is just to plug them into a calculator to get the decimal versions. 2 divided by 5 is just 0.4. 0.45 is just 0.45. 35% is the same thing as 35 divided by 100, which we know is just 0.35. If I plug in 3 out of 8 into my calculator, I'll get 0.375. So which is the greatest of these numbers? 0.45. Number 53 is just like number 51. I'm going to divide in order to convert everything into decimal form. So 19% is just 19 divided by 100. Well, we figured it out that that is just 0.19. If I plug 3/16 into my calculator, I get 0.1875. 0.155 is just the same in decimal. And if I plug 2 out of 15 into my calculator, I'll get about 0.13333 and so on. So which of these is the biggest? Clearly, 0.19 is the biggest number in that set, otherwise known as 19%. Our last question is question 61. It asks us, which one of these doesn't belong? Which one doesn't not have the same value as the other three? Well, looking at it right away, we can know that 24% is equal to 24 over 100. We've been using that all along. And we know that 24 over 100 equals 0.24, which is definitely not the same as 2.4. But just to make sure, let's plug 6 divided by 25 into our calculator, and sure enough, when we do that, we get 0.24. So which one doesn't belong? 2.4 is not the same as all the others. Thanks, and I hope this helped with your homework.